Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for today's program, The Flag and the History of American Art. Since our nation's founding, the American flag has been a poignant symbol used by artists in a variety of expressive media. For some, it has been a way of arousing national pride and speaking to the country's resistance in the face of adversity. For others, it has been a means for critiquing government policy during times of war, charges of colonialism, racism, sexism, and homophobia. So in celebration of Flag Day, during this lecture, we're going to examine how artists have critiqued, included, challenged, and celebrated the U.S. flag throughout the history of American art. And so this program is led by Meg Black, Ph.D., who's the past chair of art education at Salem State University. Her research focuses on aesthetics and aesthetic development. Her published writings include You're Taking Us Where? Reaction and Response to a Guided Art Museum Field Trip, that was published in the Visual Arts Education in Museums and Galleries. She's also published in Hand Papermaking Magazine. Her artwork is included in many public collections, including the U.S. Department of State, in art in embassies, including in Belgrade, Serbia, and she's also has art in the state of New Hampshire, in Concord, New Hampshire, places in Topsfield, Massachusetts. Her art's all over the place. So we again want to thank the Corning Foundation and the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring. And everyone, let's give Meg a big virtual round of applause for joining us here this morning. And Meg, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. That was very, very sweet of you, Robert. So, well, welcome everybody. So it is exciting to be talking to so many people from around the country, and I appreciate the effort you put into this to join us today. So, as Robert said, well, let me give you the idea of where this lecture came from. I give a lot of library lectures. As an art historian, I've been an art history professor, art education professor for 39 years. I keep thinking that can't be, but I think it is because it started in 1984. So I think that's right. But so in that very long time, I've studied a lot of works of art, obviously, and artistic movements and things of that nature. And so typically I give a few lectures a year based on some holidays or topics that seem to be, on everyone's mind. So last summer I was in Williamsburg, Virginia, for you people from Virginia. My daughter lived there. She just moved to Vermont, but she and I were throwing pots in a pottery studio, and this lovely young woman from Belgium was there. And she had married a U.S. serviceman, and she was commenting, she said, I'm just so amazed at how often I see the American flag. I mean, you guys just wrap yourself in this flag. Everywhere you go, there's American flags. And I'd never thought of that being a Native American. I never thought of it, a native born American. And she said, we don't do that in Belgium. You don't see the flag. She said, everybody here is so patriotic. And this, surprised me because obviously lately in the press, there's been a lot of talks about patriotism in American politics. And so it was very surprising to hear someone talk about us that way. And I said, well, all right, then I think the thing to do, I'm just going to get a little bit brighter here. There we go. I think the thing to do would be to look at how the American flag has been used by artists for since our inception of our country. And I did a lot of editing. I mean, this is an educational lecture, so I tried to find images that, as Robert just shared with us, would be examples of many of those topics. But by the time it was done, I just want to warn you, I could only really show you about 16, 17 images, and there are hundreds. So I did my best to edit and get cover all our tracks. But if you want to learn more about this, you can do some searching on your own, and you'll find that there's quite a bit. So there's 3 questions I want you to think about during the lecture. You can jot them down real quickly if you have paper and pencil, or take a screenshot. But what changes do you notice about how the flag is depicted as we move through history? These questions will also appear in the last slide. So if you don't get a chance to write them down, we'll revisit them. And then which image do you consider most patriotic? And then similarly, which image do you consider most controversial? So these are the three questions we're going to be looking for as we move through our lecture. So the history of Flag Day, and my mom, it was 92 yesterday, so that was Flag Day is a big day for us. So Flag Day commemorates the adoption of the flag by the United States, which occurred on June 14th, 1777, by a resolution adopted by the Second Continental Congress. It also marks the birthday of the United States Army, which Congress authorized as the American Continental Army on June 14th, 1775. So twice we have June 14th coming up. The first public celebration was in Hartford, Connecticut. I think some of you are from Connecticut during the first summer of 1861. So I think that's, everybody realizes what an important time that was in American history. This is the beginning of the Civil War. In the late 1800s, schools all over the United States held Flag Day programs to contribute to the Americanization of immigrant children. And the observance caught on with individual communities. And it's for that reason that it was for immigrant children that I chose our last slide, which so you'll have to stay at the end to find out what the last slide is, as a actually very contemporary image. And you'll see what I mean when we get there. So I am an art history professor, so I always have to start with something ancient, but no fear, these will go pretty quickly. But since ancient times, flags have been used as symbols of authority. And we look here, this is in the Louvre, this is the stele of Naram Sin, and he's an ancient Sumerian ruler from the Akkadian clan. And you see him charging up this mountain here. You see he's much bigger. This is literally the beginning of taking the bull by the horns. He's got a bull horns on his hat, but you can see he's the most important figure here. And his army is announcing that he's coming up this mountain here to the sun god, and he's going to jump up that mountain and just in 2 leaps. And here, although they're very faded, were the flags telling the sun god. You can even see this guy's language. This is the words he's shouting to tell them that that Naram Sin, that the conqueror, is coming. And again, these are this is a very old stele. It's from 2200 BCE. So it can be forgiven if some of the text is missing. By ancient Rome, we see in the column of the Arch of Titus, here on this wall is the very famous reliefs carving, and it shows the Jews being led into Rome. And you see them coming into the arch. The arch always represents Rome because the Romans were great builders. Rome wasn't built in a day. That's coming from that metaphor comes from their great building ability. And you see them bringing their menorah here. This is from the Second Temple. This is from Solomon's Temple. And they're being led into Rome as captives by the Roman sentry, by the Roman legion. And here, here's their flag telling the people that the Roman conquerors have achieved their goal, their message. Here's another flag here. I know they're very stiff. They're more like a banner than a flag. And they're leading these captives into Rome with the spoils of from the Second Temple, from Solomon's Temple. And by the way, these captives, a year later, will be put to work to build the Colosseum. So the Colosseum was built by captive Jews from Jerusalem. And this is around 72 CE, 72 AD. And then when we get, and there's a lot of images that I could have included here, but we'll go right up. I'm just going to get rid of myself for a minute there so you can see the slides. But you can see here, this is the death of General Wolfe. And General Wolfe is an English general. Here's the British flag that we see here. The British flag, the Union Jack, has 2 countries on it. You can think of the X and then the plus sign. The plus sign is for the patron saint of England is St. George. That's why you always have these King Georges. And then the patron saint of Scotland is St. Andrew. That's St. Andrew's golf course. And At the time, for a time, England and Scotland were one country under King James. He's the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Yes, he's the son of Mary. And when he takes over from Scotland, Scotland and England are joined together as one country. So that's why you see the British flag looking like that. And the importance of that is it's at certain points in our history, we actually had that flag in many different varieties until we came up to the Stars and Stripes. So, but you see him here, he's dying and he's been mortally wounded and he's taking his last breaths. And he's kind of has this Christ-like figure here, which is not accidental. We want to see him as this martyr, as this person giving up his life for a bigger cause. And then you see in the background, one of his soldiers coming in with the signed treaty from the French. This is the French and Indian War, and saying that the French have abandoned their position and that he does not die in vain. And you see this Native American here, and we notice him right away because he's dressed, of course, very differently. And already in a, it's hard to imagine if these people are wearing these heavy coats. They're standing in front of the St. Lawrence River. This is the river here. So they're in Canada, basically. The St. Lawrence goes up through New York State into Canada. And so already you get this idea, this guy's probably not dressed like this. In fact, you see that he's wearing his thicker garments are right here at his side. And we're going to be reintroduced to him in several slides from now. So that's why I'm pointing him out. And yeah, so the theme of sacrifice is very important here. And again, he sacrificed his life, and the flag, which we assume is covered with blood even, is in the background. So flags have been used as symbols of authority and victory and patriotism and propaganda. And you see here, you're saying, well, where's the propaganda? Well, this is Napoleon. And Napoleon, this is a French painting. This is in the Louvre. And you see him, and he's touching this plague victim, one of his own soldiers. This is Napoleon in Jaffa. Jaffa is now a current city in Israel. But at the time, it's part of Egyptian. It had been filled with native Egyptians. You can see them over here. And Napoleon has invaded Egypt, and that's where he gets a lot of the spoils that go back to the Louvre. And he's in this plague house. And the plague house, of course, is killing not only the Egyptians, but his own soldiers. The campaign in Jaffa was going very badly for Napoleon. But rather than send that message home to the French, which would have been political, disaster if it got into the press, this painting depicts a very different image. We see Napoleon as Christ. He's touching this soldier as if he could heal him. Like the touch of Napoleon is all that is needed here. And even his soldiers cannot stand the stench of the dying. We see dead soldiers here in the foreground, but it doesn't bother Napoleon because it's like he's beyond that. And in the background, we see what all of us would assume to be the French flag. Well, there it is. There's the tricolor, right? Right in the background. But the reality is that the tricolor, in fact, here's images of Christ doing something very similar that we see Napoleon doing. We can see it coming right off of this image right here. This is not the French flag. This is the flag of Napoleon. This is the anarchy flag. The flag of France at the time is this one. In fact, we don't really have an official flag at the time, but it's the closest we have is the King's Standard. And we have the fleur-de-lis here, which you may recognize in a lot of French paintings. You see that fleur-de-lis. You see that on the windows of the Notre Dame Cathedral and the stained glass windows, signifying the importance of the king in all things French. And then we see this, of course, we see the French flag here. By now, we are starting to recognize this as the French flag. This is in 1832, but this is after Napoleon has been defeated at Waterloo. And we see another French flag way here in the background. It's hard to see in this slide here, but there's a French flag hanging over Notre Dame. These are the towers of Notre Dame. So we see this also as flags, not only as propaganda, but also being used to stir up rebellion. And we can consider that there's been a lot of talk lately about the Confederate flag and its role in American history. So in the past few years, we've seen a similar situation where flags, again, this was not the French flag. This was the flag of Napoleon, who has since been defeated in Waterloo by the time Delacroix gives us this painting of liberty leading the people. And by the way, she is not only not all over every Air France airplane route, but she's wearing a cap here. And her cap is the cap of a freed slave from ancient Rome. And it even has the symbol on it. Again, it's a little hard to see in these slides, but the symbol is in Latin saying, I'm a freed slave. So the freedom that these people are looking for, not only the gentry, but the common person, you can see with the different clothing they're wearing, and the children, who, by the way, has just stolen a pouch from a dead French soldier, and his guns. So he's well armed, and he's got some booty here with him as he comes flying over the French like to put up these barricades. You've seen those maybe recently with the recent rebellion in French about them raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. Every now and then, if you look at those images, you see something very similar where the roads in Paris have been upheaved. They're upheaved and they create these barricades. So, and then their flag has also been used to honor those lost in rebellion. And this, of course, is the Normandy, the American cemetery in France, where you see the American and the French flag, which is now, of course, the French flag, in this very, very big cemetery. So flags, by the time we get to America, using the flag as a symbol of all of these things it's not like we invented this idea at all. So is it any wonder that images of the American flag have been used for all of these purposes and then some since the beginning of America itself? And of course, the answer is yes, especially in a country that has the First Amendment right of free speech. You're going to get a lot of images of the flag. So the American flag has been a poignant symbol for artists since our nation's founding. For many, it has been a way of rousing national pride and speaking to the country's resistance in the face of adversity. And that's primarily like the British during the Revolutionary War, or it could be seen as the Confederate flag during the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, any of our conflicts, all of a sudden the flag becomes a symbol of resistance and adversary. For others, it has been a means for critiquing the nation during times of war and a way of pointing out the long-standing histories of colonialism, racism, sexism, and homophobia that are still unfolding. So these are just a few of the many images of the flag in American art. So yeah, we start out with a very Currier and Eves type of image of Betsy Ross showing the first American flag to George Washington, who has just happened by her Philadelphia home with some of his followers here. And they seem to be very approving of the flag. And we see that Washington has put down his sword, or no, actually, this is a musical instrument that has been put aside. The music has been halted for just a little time while Washington has entered her home. Well, a very lovely home, by the way. She's doing pretty well for herself. But the big question is, who created the US flag, the first flag? And many of us want to say it was Betsy Ross, but the reality is we're not 100% sure, because it was her nephew who made this claim after she's died. He makes this in writing. He makes this claim that she was the creator of the first American flag. She sews this flag together. We have the 13 colonies represented in both stars and stripes here for the time being. But the evidence is compelling that she indeed is responsible for this, but it's not conclusive. There's no real second source that says, yep, it was her. In fact, there's another woman who it might have been her who creates the first flag, but as we don't know her name, I've seen her name once or twice But as evidence of how important it is to think it's Betsy Ross, I can't remember this woman's name, the poor woman. But several of her relatives testified to having heard extensive details of the flag's creation. So again, this is a second source saying it was my Aunt Betsy who did this. The testimony is plausible, but there's no preserved documents to say, yes, absolutely, that it was Betsy Ross. So there's no one has emerged to either confirm or contradict the claims made by Betsy's descendants. So she goes down in history as the first seamstress of the American flag. But look at the date of this, by the way. This is the birth of Old Glory. This is 1917, way after Betsy Ross would have made that first flag. And it tells us, so I want you to start looking at these dates. It starts to tell us about what's going on in American history that creates this opportunity for the flag to be created or to become an important topic in American art. So going back a little bit, we have this image of a flag. Now, let me just be clear. Once you, a flag, these are images of the flag in American art. You cannot use an American flag for anything but the purpose of flying the flag properly. As I was doing the research for this lecture, I watched a lot of lectures about how to properly display the flag and how not to. And I was surprised, I will admit, being the daughter and granddaughter and daughter-in-law of veterans, just how important it was to display the flag, very, very particular way to do it and not to do it. So once a flag is used for any other purpose than to be flown properly, it's no longer a flag. So anyway, we have in Frederick Edwin Church, our banner in the sky. This is, again, look at the date, 1861. And it is believed that this painting was done right after the firing on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. So it's not really a flag, right? But we can see how he's getting this flag imagery. We have the stripe, the stars and the stripes here in the sky. But so it at first glance is quite lovely and patriotic. But as you keep looking at it, you start to see other things in this that are far more disturbing or far more, there's a sense of foreboding in this painting. So, for example, look at the divide between these two lands, right? This looks like water. It's a little bit hard to understand for sure. But this divide, water is often used as a metaphor for a divide. And we see this land looks very promising, right? There's a lot of vegetation until we get over here. And then we notice that there's a lot of dead vegetation, which is much more prominent here. We see that these trees are dead. And we notice how the sun, which is on this side, is shining on these trees, but the sun that's shining on them is shining from over here. So it's kind of creating this cross image, and it leaves you to wonder what is the real subject, or it's not the beautiful landscape you originally might see. And then when you look at the clouds, you see that there's a storm forming. So it has this read into it that there's that Frederick Edwin Church is aware that this flag is under a lot of stress at the time of this painting. And you can even, sunset, this is clearly a sunset image, and that also tends to be a metaphor in art for something that's ending. So this painting, this was reproduced and printed in pro-union sympathizers during the Civil War, so they would have had copies of it. And so now it's in the museum in San Francisco. And then this one by Child Hassam, he's a Boston-based American Impressionist. And again, look at the date. This is 1917. It says the day of Allied victory, but this is the day that the Allies, the Americans, get into World War I. And you notice this is Fifth Avenue, which President Wilson had designated as the Avenue of the Allies. So there's this big parade at the beginning of the war, and you notice that you see the French and the American and the British flags flying over Fifth Avenue in this cityscape of these very traditional American, these are called Beaux Arts buildings. In fact, this one looks a lot like a church. I would imagine it is, which would be significant, as a religious symbol, which is very typical of these types of paintings. But we see that, oh yeah, it looks like he got some of this from Claude Monet, which he absolutely did. He's like many American impressionists. Child has studied in France. And then he comes back from France and he has the style, down pretty well. But Monet was he's very popular, of course, for his water lilies and his fauna paintings, but he has done a series of these French paintings where the tricolor is prominent in the paintings. The French, as you may know from your history, were involved with an awful lot of wars in the 19th century. So he had plenty of subject matter for the many times that they overthrew their kings and they overthrew their dictators, and then they become part of this organization and that one, and it goes back and forth quite a bit. So it was easy for Child Hussam to relate this image to his own on Fifth Avenue. And again, by means of it being declared that it was the Avenue of the Allies. So here we go, another date for us, 1942, and we are now in the beginning of World War II. And it's also the end of the Depression. And so the the government, to help people get out of the unemployment, again, I'm sure you know you remember your history. But the Farm Security Administration, in part of the New Deal, was an organization that hired photographers to photograph the American landscape, culture, people, as a way of communicating what people were enduring during this time. The most famous photographer of the time is probably Dorothea Lange, whose very famous Migrant Mother. If you look that up, you say, oh my gosh, yes, I know that photograph. Was a way of showing people back in the East how people in the West, especially like the farm pickers, the migrant workers on the farms in California, were enduring in really awful poverty at the time. And so this was a way, again, for the government to help employ people and also to spread the word about what people were enduring. So it's very unusual, though, in 1942 to hire a Black man, an African-American, to be in part of this photography group. Gordon Parks was from Chicago, and he was a fashion photographer when he was hired to come to Washington and to photograph the people in Washington who were enduring the beginning of the World War II. And he meets this woman, Ella Watson, and she is as you can see, she is a cleaner in the U.S. Capitol. She is a very poor woman. You can see by her dress that's pinned together. And this is the tools of her trade, a mop and a broom. Ella Watson was a widow. Her husband had been lynched a few years earlier, leaving her a widow, and she's also a grandmother. So this woman is raising her own children and her grandchildren in this very tight apartment. And initially, the name of this painting, and of course you can see the American flag behind her. The initial photograph was named Working Woman in Washington. It was not named American Gothic. And when Gordon Parks was hired to work for the Farm Security Administration, the person who hired him, I think his name is John Steiner. I may have that first name wrong, but he was a very progressive-minded guy, and he understood that hiring Gordon Parks would have its, would resonate with people because he was an African-American man. Well, not soon after Gordon Parks joins the Farm Security Administration in Washington, that he takes this photograph. So within a few months, he has now the most famous photograph of his entire career. And he shows it to Mr. Steiner, and Mr. Steiner says, no way are we publishing that. He said, you got the idea, but we cannot show a Black woman with as a cleaner in front of the American flag to the public at this time. And so the photograph ended up in a drawer and was never published at the time. And it was not published till the late 1950s. I think it's 1957. The first time it was published was in Ebony magazine, which had hired Gordon Parks as one of their chief photographers by that time. And not until the 1960s, when Gordon Parks was now the first African-American photographer for Life magazine, was it published in a more, broadly circulated publication, which was Life magazine. And the photo at the title at that point, Gordon Parks changes to American Gothic. And it's named after a very famous painting, which you're probably familiar with, by Grant Wood, of the same title. And of course, he's playing off the distinction between the single woman and this is a farmer and his daughter. It's often like a farmer and his wife, but no, this is his daughter. And by the way, just an art history fun fact, this was Grant Wood's dentist who's posing as the farmer. And you just wonder, like, wow, if you're a dentist, you might want to smile and advertise your wares a little bit better, buddy. But yeah, so and this is his daughter, and this is the model for this is actually Grant Wood's younger sister. So it's kind of an interesting, because you always think it's the husband and wife. At the time, it's now in the Whitney Museum of American Art, but at the time it was actually in the Chicago Art Institute, which is why Gordon Parks was so familiar with this painting. But the idea behind it was not to show so much a discrimination in his words when he talks about this painting, when he talked about it. What he said was it was to show the strength of this woman, that she had so much riding on her shoulders and was able to support her family, no matter how, basically by being a washerwoman in Washington during the World War II. And just by having the tools of her trade upside down, they almost present themselves as weapons, as I guess the idea is that they're not useful. You can't use a broom or a mop in the positions that she has them in. So very famously, year later, 1943, we have Norman Rockwell, Rosie the Riveter. And this is one of those famous and favorite ones that we all, I'm sure you recognize on some level. But here's Rosie, who at the time, actually, her name was Mary Doyle, and she was actually only 19 years old. And apparently she was really, really pretty and really, really tiny. And so Norman Rockwell actually sends her a letter apologizing for the way he depicted her in this very, very famous cover for the May, I have it right here. It's the Saturday Evening Post from May 1943. So this was a cover for the magazine, which was a very popular magazine at the time. But a little closer look at Rosie. She's very muscular and she's eating a ham sandwich. I mean, it literally is a ham sandwich. We can even figure out what she's eating. And she's brought it from home in her lunchbox that says Rosie on it. So nobody can take her lunch by mistake because she's taking very good care of it. And the riveter rests on her lap. Riveters were used to construct fighter planes. And it almost looks like a weapon, doesn't it? The way that it's sitting on her lap. And then we notice the hose on it. And we'll see in the next slide why we think we have that hose there. Her lunchbox, yeah, there's her name on it. And she is on a mission. Even on her lunch break, she's alert and on duty. I mean, look at that attitude she's got, right? And she's even got the glasses, the safety glasses, but they almost look like pilot glasses, don't they? And here, again, here she is, the riveter, but she's got like these glasses that look like pilot glasses. She wears loafers and bright red socks. So this would have been like her, the daring part of her outfit, to have these bright red socks, and her foot stomps on a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. And Mein Kampf was his book that was his propaganda book about why he thought he was superior to other people. But if we look closely in her pocket is a compact for her to powder her nose. And then she has a lacy handkerchief. So she hasn't abandoned all of her girl boss paraphernalia here. And then upon closer look, we even see that she's just painted her lips. She's got lipstick on, which would have been pretty, daring thing for a young woman to do back in 1942, to walk around with lipstick like that. And then we have almost this necklace of her very important pins to show her patriotism. And she's got her victory pin and her Red Cross pin, and she's looking pretty decked out there. A lot of bling there with her pins. And she was the daughter of a Vermont logger who went on to graduate. She went on to graduate as a dental hygienist. The original painting sold in 2002 for $5 million. So that's pretty good. She was only paid $10 for 2 days worth of work, which was roughly $140 by today's standards. But yeah, Norman Rockwell actually sends her a note saying, "I'm really sorry I did that to you." And this is Rosie back in, I don't remember the date of this photograph, but she's posing with her very, very famous image. So yeah, this is where he got it from. So Norman Rockwell is always thought of as, this favorite American artist, but not different from Child Hazam. He was very familiar with European classical art, in this case, Renaissance art from Michelangelo. And he, as any artist, especially back then, would have studied. When you studied art history, you studied the Renaissance and you studied Michelangelo. But you were just indoctrinated in Michelangelo. So he uses it. He doesn't even try to pretend, does he? He uses the same pose and the same everything to get his Rosie that he learned from Michelangelo. And I've had the chance, I live in Massachusetts, so I've had the chance to go to the Rockwell Museum. It's quite lovely. The architect, by the way, the Rockwell Museum is the same architect as the George Bush Library in Dallas, Texas. So just a fun fact. It's Robert Stern is his name. And but if you look at Norman Rockwell's sketches, you'll see a ton of these drawings of these famous, very famous images. So this is right off the Sistine Chapel. It's the prophet Isaiah. And if you read the prophet Isaiah, it's Isaiah 27, you'll find our friend Rosie. The Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, and powerful sword. Levitation, the gliding serpent, levitation, the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea. So twice we have the image of the serpent and the coiled serpent. And then we see Rosie with her serpent shape here, and it's connected to what looks very much like her riveter gun that she's got here. So so he was very classically trained. He puts a female face on a very muscular body, and we look at both figures from below, making them look larger than life. He's in a much more comfortable chair than she is. In fact, she's kind of like sitting on a stool of some sort, which doesn't look very comfortable. So by 1954, we're now in the Cold War. And we have Jasper Johns, who's actually still with us. This is a photograph from about 1967. And he paints the American flag as an image, again, of the American flag based on a dream he's had. And he uses encaustic, which is a very ancient medium. It's a medium that was, it goes back to ancient Egypt, but it was very popular with the Romans. And it's using wax and pigment. The wax holds the pigment, much like oil would hold pigment, or acrylic would hold the pigment. But he's painting this image of the American flag at a time where abstract art, abstract expressionism is like the art mode of the day, and yet he's painting something that will become very synonymous with pop art, using a everyday symbol and elevating it to a status beyond its original intention. That's what pop art is essentially doing. So in his flag in 1954, it's again encaustic, and underneath are advertisements from newspapers about everything from what's on sale to the Cold War, to political upheaval at the time. So you get this whole like smorgasbord of topics that are going on during this time underneath his painting. And you can see them if you walk up close enough to it. There's only 48 stars here because we don't have Alaska or Hawaii as states left yet. But very much like Betsy Ross, he makes this by hand. He paints this, very different medium. But again, the design was done for him at a time where artists wanted to be responsible for their expression, right? For their imagery, like artists always want to be imaginative and great imaginations. And oh my gosh, like Monet with those wonderful water lilies, or Van Gogh with his irises, they want to be in charge of the composition. But that's not what's happening here at all. We see Jasper Johns taking an everyday object and turning it into something else. So he's very limited in that way. It was met with a lot of hostility. It was considered anti-patriotic by a lot of people. Again, this is the height of the Cold War, and emotions ranged, a lot. In fact, right now, this is under pretty heavy glass to this day at the Museum of Modern Art, because it was not attacked, but a lot of people had a lot of issues with this. And this is the kind of painting that would get, that might, warrant somebody throwing, something at it. But it asks us to bring ourselves to the image. Like, what do you feel when you look at this flag? Is this blasphemous? Is the fact that he's kind of made it dirty and ugly, that it's like a little bit like, oh, you see down here, it almost looks a little burned. And then again, the advertisements on it and the way the paint is very clear. But it brought up a lot of controversy at the time. And we start to see the shift away from the flag as a patriotic symbol and one that's a little more nuanced. By 1967, we're now at the height of the Vietnam War, and we have Faith Ringgold's flag. It's called the American People Series number 18. This is now in the Smithsonian Museum of Art in Washington, the National Gallery of Art in Washington. So what are you looking at here? Again, it's very ambiguous. You'll start to see the meanings go from very clear to very ambiguous. And we see here a well-dressed, we think they're a couple. We see that their arms are intertwined, but we're not 100% sure. And then we see that their arms are intertwined to this African-American man whose clothing looks very more basic to us. Although in 1960s, there was a lot of these black turtlenecks that were kind of popular. And we notice that where he's holding his hand over where he would pledge to the flag, blood is seeping through. And then we notice he's holding the knife. And we get the idea that he has inflicted this wound onto himself. But the blood from this wound is carried over throughout the composition. And it gives the idea that what's happening to him, even though he's in this kind of zone, is infecting or impacting everybody else in this composition. We even see at some point that the blood is covering one of these stars. We notice none of them are looking at each other. They're looking at us. In fact, their eyes are really bugging out at us. The ones that are most hidden are his. But the idea is, what impact does this violence have on the rest of the people who are communicating within this, are the subjects of this painting? And Faith Ringgold, she's painting this at the height of a lot of racial riots. The Watts riots in LA are happening. There's a lot of unrest about the Vietnam War and who's being sent to the Vietnam War. But very similarly to Jasper Johns' painting, the viewer who comes to this is going to bring their own ideas to the painting, and they're going to take away something that is unique to them as well. Here's our friend, the Native American. He's now being painted by a Native American. This is 1970, Fritz Scholder. And Fritz Scholder is a Native American. Well, he's part Native American, and he always says that he was raised as a non-Indian, although his grandmother is enrolled in the California, and forgive my lack of pronunciation, but the Luis Eno tribe. And similar to what Gordon Parks is doing, at the time that Gordon Parks paints this image, I'm sorry, not paints, but photographs this image, African Americans were being portrayed through the more popular culture. Like think of Aunt Jemima, the way she was portrayed on the pancake mix. So the idea was that he wanted to portray the African Americans of his own community through the lens of another African American. That was the idea. And that's what we see here with Fritz Scholder. He's doing the same thing. When he was a professor in New Mexico at the Native American Art Heritage, this is the way that Native Americans were being portrayed. And in 1970, you would have been hard pressed to find a woman in a, on a nation who dressed like that and spent the day weaving rugs. That probably wasn't happening. Same with Native American men doing these, these kind of dances. What he saw was something more like this. This is what his neighborhoods looked like. And a lot of the, the wares that they were making, like this jewelry for sale, were more for tourists who were coming to their environments, not this kind of more romanticized image. And he starts to play with images of Native Americans that had been portrayed by, like, for example, Benjamin West, who was actually born in America, but ends up making his career in England. So he's reigniting some of these images. And that, again, when we look at this image of the Native American compared to the rest of these participants in this painting, we see that he looks very different. He's dressed very differently. He's portrayed very differently. And so he kind of brings this guy back to life as a figure that now belongs to the Native American artist. And we see here the American Indian, 1970. Again, it's very ambiguous. We see this man wrapped in the American flag, but he also has his boots made of probably deer leather, deer skin. And then we see him with his undergarb it's much more traditional. In fact, like here we see him as his tooth necklace. So the idea is it's this tension between Native Americans and Americans who our ancestry would have come from a different country. And it sort of puts us back at us, like where do they belong? As Fritz Scholder says, he's only 1/4 Native American, and he always has felt that tension. Like, do I belong on my grandmother's nation? Do I belong to the more dominant culture? How do Native Americans swing with this dual relationship of their native identity and the identity of the larger culture? And so he dresses him in this very Native American looking outfit, right? This is what, people would portray Native Americans as wearing, but he does it with the stars and stripes. And then what shows up to us here is the tomahawk, which again is a image we associate with Native Americans. Ming Smith is African-American woman. She's the only one who was a member of a group called the Kamongi Workshop. And this is a workshop in New York City in the late 1960s. Kamongi was a poem by Langston Hughes, so they adopt that name for their group. And again, very similar. They want to portray the African Americans amongst them through their own lens. They don't want to portray from the more dominant culture. And so she shows us, again, a very ambiguous image. This is what's called a formalist image, meaning that the form of it, when you look at it, it's very geometric. And you can see how the grids sort of tell us where our eyes should go. If you notice how the grids here kind of go right through this guy. And then we see the 3 grids and more 3 grids. and then behind it, we see three panels of the American flag, but it's very hard to determine where these panels are. Where are these things? Are these behind the window, which kind of looks that way? And then these seem to be reflected in the window from outside. And then when we look behind him, we see people who are walking in front of him on the sidewalk. And these are passerby that are probably not paying a heck of a lot of attention to this man whose glasses seem to be projecting, looking into an American flag. So this is a very Baroque idea. Baroque art is one where there's many layers of depth of meaning and very many layers of depth of participation. So it's almost like an opera still where you're looking at something is staged, very staged and very dramatic. And the minute you turn away, this action is going to be over. It's going to just, you know, what am I trying to say? It's odd that she was able to even capture this in the first place, because it looks so spontaneous. It's very hard to capture an image like that, to have all things lining up for you like this. But just all these different layers. I mean, I can't even count them. It's a 2D image, but if you start to count the layers, there's probably 15 to 20 that go back into space and then go forward in space at the same time, making it very complicated. And at the end of the day, we're just not quite sure how to read this person who's the only really stationary thing in this whole image, because the cars are moving, the people are moving, the flags appear to be waving, and yet he's just kind of taking it all in. He's in one level, he's ambiguous, and on another level, he's very much the center of attention. I don't know if this is going to work, but we're going to try it. There we go. So let me. My country is a state of mind. My country is a state of mind. My country is a state of mind. Country is a state of mind. Country is. All right. So we did work. Okay. So I'm gonna. This is what happens when you are standing in front of this. This is by Namjoon Pak, and it's at the Smithsonian. It's at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington. And you'll see what it is. It's the American flag. It's all these television screens. This is from 1996. And it shows every president, US president, from Harry Truman to Bill Clinton, coming onto these screens. And the idea is he's from South Korea. And since the 1950s, when he comes to America, he's fascinated by American culture and our tendency to make celebrities out of our presidents and presidents out of our celebrities. And he's talking about this in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And again, this is just not something that other countries do. And I think sometimes it takes an immigrant to really see things from the outside, go, wow, this is a very uniquely American thing. And so what he's done here is he's got all these television screens showing these different presidents as if they're celebrities. It's really there's 5 things that Namjoon Pak said were going to happen in the future. And he was so right. He talked about how phones would become what we now call the cell phone. He's saying this back in the 80s. He's talking about how television will be very lightweight, and he's basically how people will be able to film themselves and share it. And now when you think of TikTok and Twitter and Instagram, oh my gosh, this guy was way ahead of himself when he said, this is where this is going. And again, he's using television screens to do now what would be done with very flat images, like a liquid, surfaces. But he was aware of American penchant, again, for making politicians celebrities and celebrities politicians by superimposing politicians onto icons of American pop culture, the TV, which is, again, we don't think of that. We are like TV obsessed. Our shows, and most people have at least 2 or 3 TVs in their homes, and cable TV, and then there's Netflix and Hulu and all these ways to interact with your television, that it was just very uniquely American to have done that. So There we go. And then we have John Quick to See Smith. She's another Native American artist. She's having a retrospective right now at the Whitney. And in her commentary about American culture is how we want everything so big. So she plays off of Jester John's flag that I just showed you. And this is called I See Red McFlag. And it's a commentary on everything we do. We want big houses, big cars, big lifestyles, and how that impacts our environment when we collect too much, when we have too much. And she equates big with the Big Mac, which name just, of course, big is right in the Big Mac. And then with Disney World, which is also very big, every building is like giant size, way bigger than it technically needs to be. And then she has like these Mickey Mouse ears on this commentary about the bigness of America. This one, again, TikTok guy. I mean, look at this, 1983. And this is his pronunciation is Quang Chi. And Quang Chi, very similar to Nam June Pak, he's an immigrant from Hong Kong. He dies in 1990 during the AIDS crisis that I certainly remember. Many of you may remember. But it's kind of a funny story. This is an image that might at first, again, be a little ambiguous to read, but it's a celebration of how artists go beyond culture. Like I just showed you Michelangelo. We just understand Michelangelo. You don't have to speak Italian. You don't have to even go to Sistine Chapel. But as a world citizen, we recognize the beauty of Michelangelo's art, and we're just fascinated by this person. And so similarly, Quang Chi, he saw artists as global citizens who share the same values and as advocates for making the world a better place for their desire to share their vision. And so here he is in his Mao Zedong suit. And why is he wearing a Mao Zedong suit? Because when he was in the 1970s, when he's living in New York, very impoverished, and he's taking these wonderful photographs of him in front of all these New York City iconic, icon buildings, the Empire State Building, etc. His parents come to visit from Toronto. They live in Canada, and they're going to take him and his sister out to dinner on Window of the World, which was the restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center. And he has nothing to wear because he doesn't have a lot of money. So he's like, what am I supposed to wear at this restaurant? And so he fishes out, I believe he fishes out from his drawer, this really old Mao Zedong looking outfit. If you remember Mao, this is how he dressed. And it's the early 70s. So this is when Nixon has gone to China to open up the relationships with us in China. It's still during the Vietnam War, but it's towards the end. And so when he shows up in this Mao outfit, the waiters actually thought he was a Chinese diplomat. And so he got all this great treatment at this restaurant that he really couldn't even afford to be in because they thought he was actually a diplomat. So after that, he always wore his Mao outfit everywhere he went and in all of his photographs. So what he's showing you here, and again, look at this, is just so pre-TikTok, right? He's going to take this selfie of himself. At the time, he needs to take the picture with the flash because we don't have cell phones yet. It's hard to imagine a world like that. But he's showing you his Chinese origin behind his American origin. And he's looking out at you from this is his past and this is his future. And in his world, he's celebrating these two cultures as two distinct colors, but two colors worthy of his attention. So here is and congratulations to all of you who waited to the end. I really appreciate it. Here is the last slide, which you're thinking, wait a minute, how is this the last slide if we're going in chronological order? But I told you, I will explain to you how I think this is a very contemporary slide. So this is, some of you who've been to the Met recognize this image. This is Emmanuel Lotze. Lotza, this is how you pronounce it. And this is George Washington crossing the Delaware, which is an enormous painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It's, 255 inches long, 149 inches high. It's gigantic. But Lutza is not an American. So his depiction of Washington's attack on the Hessians, that's the German soldiers who were fighting with the British, was a great success in America and in Germany, where it was painted. It's painted in Dusseldorf, Germany. Lutza began his first version of this subject in 1849, but that painting was damaged in his studio by fire in 1850. And although restored, was again destroyed in a bombing raid in 1942 during the war. In 1850, Lutza began this version of the subject, which was placed on exhibition in New York during October of 1851, and it was instantly purchased by Marshall O. Roberts for $10,000, which was a huge sum of money at the time. It was moved to Texas in 1950, because it was too popular with the crowds. And so they sent it to a museum in Dallas for like 20 years, just to, thinking, well, maybe it won't attract as many people in Dallas. I don't think that worked as very well, but it was returned to the Met in 1970. And if you look at this scene, it's Washington crosses the Delaware River at midnight on Christmas Day. But if you look at this scene, it's not midnight, the sun is rising. And so there's a lot of liberties he took with this painting. So we see it as a very cold winter day, but even though the event was at midnight, the river here is not the Delaware River. The Delaware is much, much more narrow. This is really too wide. It's the Rhine River. So he's kind of going over to the Rhine and getting some of these images and painting them as if they're the Delaware. It's painted with really small paintbrushes. So you can imagine how long it took. It must have taken at least a year every single day to do this. The figures are in their own worlds. They're wearing different clothing. There's no uniform. We see Washington with his general there, but that's only uniform. His army doesn't have a uniform. In fact, no one even looks the same. So it's very similar to images on D-Day when we see the D-Day invasion. I'll show you that in a second. Washington would have been sitting. He would not have been standing in that boat. He would have fallen right over into that freezing cold water. So there's no way the guy was standing. And there's no way that poor guy's holding that flag, that huge flag, and that freezing cold breeze would have been able to survive it. And then there's a lot of stillness, right? And we see that like this triangular composition, which is very famous at this time period, in this very chaotic scene. And the sun is breaking through right over Washington's head. Isn't that amazing? What a coincidence. And he looks very much like a Roman emperor on a coin. If you look at Roman coins, they have that profile look. The natural imagery is very cool colors, and the soldiers are mostly warm colors. And the flag, the flag's wrong too, folks. It's a contemporary flag, not the original Stars and Stripes. So this is actually a flag that would have been flying in America in like the 1780s. So he doesn't get the flag quite right. And then it's painted in commemoration of Washington's 50th anniversary. But if you look closely at the characters in the painting, you'll see very similar to our country. These are a lot of immigrants. You see, or natives. These are not, these still make up the, the bulk of our country. You have Native American in the back of the boat, and we see this almost the same purse that we saw in the Benjamin Benjamin West painting. We see farmers huddled together, but look at their expressions. They're deep in thought. The war was going very badly for Washington. This would have been their first major victory, and they are victorious in this battle. But up until then, they are losing badly. And we notice that this guy has just a basic cloak on, whereas this guy is much better dressed. And we get the idea from his fancy hat with the feather, like stick a feather in his hat, versus his old cap, that these, again, are men of very two different class systems, but they're fighting for the same cause. And then here in the front of the boat, we have an African-American, and we have a Scotsman with his Scottish cap. and we have a man wearing the raccoon skin cap. So again, we have people from different parts of what will be the country in the front of the boat. And we see a similar image on D-Day. We see these soldiers with a very, very different mindsets and very different psychological poses as they look up at the camera, but they're in very different places emotionally and mentally, as they very similar to this are in the same situation as we see in this painting. So I had asked you, I said, there's 3 questions to think about during the lecture. What changes do you notice about the flag, how the flag is depicted, if any, as we move through history? Which image would you consider the most patriotic? And which image would you consider the most controversial? And I'll ask you to, we'll look at those in a minute, but I would ask if you have a minute, maybe you'll join my mailing list. If you go to my website, those very annoying pop down thingies will pop down, but if you sign up, you'll get, I send out a newsletter every month, and I do these fun facts, these art history fun facts, and I'll tell you about any upcoming lectures I will be having. So I'm going to stop that share. And, oh, okay, I didn't do too bad. Okay, so I did 12.
You did good, Meg. You did good. So folks, as Meg said, if you have any comments for Meg, type them into the chat. If you have any questions for Meg, type them into the Q&A, and we'll get to them now. Margaret says this, and I'll read them to you. And just so you know, a little inside baseball, Meg, only you and I can see the chat and the Q&A, so folks can't see what each other writes.
Oh.
Which is both good and bad. There's pros and cons to that.
Okay.
So Margaret says, fascinating, very informative. I hope to see more of your programs.
Oh, good, good.
Diane says, this was awesome. Thank you. Patricia has answers to the questions that you asked. Changes that she noticed. Did they become more representative of what is currently happening in the political, economic, and social scenes? Or were they always utilized to reflect the current situation? It depends on your lens and understanding of what is understood as patriotic.
Yes.
And then she goes on to define patriotic.
Yeah.
And let's see here. So let me move on from that. Also, Meg, I will let me put your website in the chat. I will do that so everyone can see it. Osmana said, stars are adding on the flag and they're designed from circle to block. Nancy says, my favorite was the church flag in the sky. I don't think I've ever seen that before. I loved it.
Thank you.
Yeah, Judy says this was very informative. Dory says it was a wonderful presentation. Daisy said, in the Ming Smith picture, it's the wrong number of stars for the flag.
Yeah, yeah. That's just it. I don't even think it's a flag. I think they're banners. And I think that's part of like we said, for many veterans in particular, depicting the flag you could see the flag is in everything. It's in beach towels and bikinis and banners and all these things. And for some people, they don't like that, and that it's become so almost kitsch. And so I wonder, she's right that I don't think those are flags so much as they're banners that are depicting the flag. Yeah. So, but good eagle eye there. Yes. So yeah.
Frank says, bravo, fascinating presentation.
Thank
you. Francis has a question for you.
Okay.
Francis, so now I'm jumping to the Q&A, Meg. Okay. Francis asks, do you think the Jasper Johns flag with the newspapers in it might be a reference to the importance of the First Amendment during the hysteria of the McCarthy hearings? I think
she may be right. That occurred to me. I have not looked it up, but I wonder about that. And good, again, really good questions. As I was doing the research, I just kind of ran out of time as we tend to do that. But I thought of that, man, this is at the height of McCarthyism. And he's just putting in all these advertisements and then political statements. So I think she's probably right. We just have to do a little bit more searching.
And unless there's any last minute questions, because we have come up on the 75-minute mark, although we did start a few minutes late, but what I think will be the last question from an anonymous attendee. Why did Ringgold show 48 stars instead of 50 in her 1967 artwork? Was she protesting Hawaii and Alaska for some reason?
I'm guessing that it was more a formalist decision because she needs them to line up more easily with the composition. Again, great question. I'm going to write these down, and maybe I'll email what I find out.
Sure.
And to you, Robert, and you can share them, because I when I get questions like that, I do like to follow up on them.
Sure. Yeah, if you can email, depending, I don't know if this is realistic, but if you can email me by tomorrow at noon, that would be great, because that'll be around the time I send out the follow-up.
Oh yeah, perfect. So the first one is the Faith Ringgold, and then the other one was the McCarthy.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So any others, I'm happy to look up. I get kind of carried away with the research. I really enjoy it. So, and once you start doing research, it just one thing leads to another.
Yeah.
So
I think we'll wrap it there. Folks, let's give Meg a big virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
And check out Meg's website. It's just her name. So www.megblack.com, and you can sign up for her email newsletter there if you're so inclined. As a reminder for those watching live, you'll receive an email from me tomorrow with the recording, the feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming virtual art history programs. July and August are booked. They're on the calendar online. You can go see them now, and that information will be in the email tomorrow. So thank you all so much. Happy belated Flag Day. Thank you to you, Meg. And I hope. Yeah. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks so much.
all right, bye guys.
Bye, Meg.